Welcome to Higher Change. We are on Chapter 22, Emotional Intelligence for Dummies, Facing Your Emotions. While it was once thought that emotions were an obstacle to rational thinking, we now know that emotion and cognitive thinking are inseparable. Rather than seeing emotions as something to ignore or avoid, we see emotions as something to pay attention to as they indicate our needs. So in this lesson, you will list effects of suppressing emotions. We'll explain why people lie as an avoidance behavior. We'll describe the role of painful emotions like shame and addiction, and understand how addictions and emotional avoidance shuts down painful emotions. And we'll describe what emotional sobriety means. So first off, let's talk about body language and masking emotions. The nonverbal ways we communicate emotions is known as our body language, which is the nonverbal expression of a person's emotional state. This includes first, our facial expressions, our posture, how we hold our heads up, and how we position our arms and legs, and our gestures. However, all cultures have display rules, which are scripts for exactly when, where, and how we ought to express our emotions in socially appropriate and culture-specific ways. Therefore, our emotions often become repressed. So if your culture says you're not supposed to express emotions, then you're going to repress those emotions. So Antonio Damasio distinguished between primary and secondary emotions. So we have primary and secondary. What are those? Primary emotions are universal, basic emotions such as anger, disgust, fear, happiness, sadness, and surprise. And these are those that we tend to repress on the deeper, more unconscious side of our mind. So these are on the deeper level. Secondary emotions have a more of a cognitive component and are considered social emotions. They are usually more of a mixture of the primary emotions. And these are often those we display to the social world around us. So because we try to mask our emotions, we tend to display those emotions that have more socially adaptive components. And so these are secondary emotions are the ones that we tend to prefer to show. So for example, let's talk about anger. Where would you put anger at? Well, anger can be either primary or secondary. Anger, if it was primary, it would be something like due to an injustice or feeling hurt or betrayed. But sometimes we express anger because we don't want to reveal our true emotions. And so anger can also be a secondary emotion if it is considered the lesser of evils to display. For example, if you really feel afraid or sad, but you cannot express those feelings because it's culturally taboo to express fear or sadness, then you may be more likely to express anger, and anger can be more of a secondary emotion. So an explosion of anger can sometimes be a secondary mask for deeper emotions about oneself and others, because anger is more socially acceptable than other feelings. So in those cases, in those incidences, anger would act as a secondary emotion because it's a mask for deeper emotions. So here's a picture of an iceberg. Anger is oftentimes just the tip of the iceberg for a lot of repressed emotions on the unconscious level. And so while anger can be a genuine feeling, oftentimes it's the superficial tip of the iceberg. And if we peel back the anger, we may discover a lot of pent-up emotions that are not being expressed. So when I work with people, I might have them do an anger map, and that's something I want my listeners to try at some point. What I would have you do is right in the middle of this diagram, something that made you angry at some point. And then on the outsides of the circle, or outsides around this, in the small circles, I would want you to think about the underlying emotions that are underneath that. So if anger was a secondary emotion, if you think about something you got angry about, what are some of the deeper underlying feelings you had? And so they may be things like fear, shame, guilt. Those would be feelings about yourself. Or they may be feelings about the other person. It may be hurt, disappointment, betrayal, and those kinds of things. So what are some feelings underneath the anger that you've experienced in the past? And I would write those feelings in the outer circles. So what are some, if it's true that we suppress a lot of emotions, are there negative effects? Well, yes, there's definitely a lot of negative effects to suppressing some of our genuine, true emotions. Some people cope with negative emotions by attempting to repress or deny their feelings. The problem with this is that it can have an insidious effect as the anger is not really resolved. Suppressing anger is not an effective solution. This has been found to triple the risk of heart attack, and the risks associated with the suppression of anger were even greater when people felt that they were treated unfairly. So there's a lot of dangers to repressing anger. So that's why it's better to be aware of it and express those feelings in a healthy, of course, constructive way. But you don't want to ignore it. It's very important to pay attention to even your hurtful or your hurting negative emotions. You have to pay attention to it, because if you try to suppress it, it'll just boil and fester within you, and that's not good either. So people accept their negative emotions, experience fewer negative emotions. It's interesting if you think about it, because like I said, negative emotions fester. So when we accept them, people tend to experience fewer of them. So ignoring or pretending you don't feel what you feel, or judging your emotions harshly, tends to cause more stress than just feeling it and moving on. So people who allow themselves to feel their disappointment, anger, or resentment have fewer symptoms of mood disorders. So people who suffer from depression, for example, oftentimes are trying to deny the sadness that they're experiencing. If you think about the movie Inside Out, for example, that's a good example of someone who, with the story of Riley, she tried to repress her sadness and it came out in depression. So people who try to repress any part of themselves, such as an unwanted emotion, desires or fears, even or sexuality, will have a loss of self-esteem and they become fragmented. Everyone needs a sense of wholeness. That means we're able to truly own all parts of ourselves. So one method of therapy that I use that helps with this is Gestalt therapy. Gestalt therapy comes from Gestalt psychology, as we've talked about before, and looks at how our awareness and perception is shaped. So Gestalt therapists seek to heighten our awareness about our emotional states through observation. So a practitioner may analyze their client's behavioral habits as a way to look for cues that indicate a client's internal state. It helps them to tap into their primary emotions that they may be repressing. And that brings us to the subject of deception. A lot of us are masking a lot of things deep down inside that we don't want to show to others. And that's because we're constantly trying to manage our image and fit in with the society around us. So lying is considered an avoidance behavior, as a person's avoiding painful truth. So when evaluating whether or not someone is lying, a person's nonverbal cues are important. So like I said with Gestalt therapists, they're constantly looking for those small cues that indicate somebody's internal state. So in the case of deception, Susan Carcinero recommends to look for these telltale signs. She says if they respond with anger to a question or attack a third party, then you know that they're deflecting away from what's going on. If they try to brush off important questions as inconsequential, this is evasive and deceptive. Sometimes you can see that someone's being deceptive if they smile at inappropriate times. So for example, if they're talking about the death of a loved one, they shouldn't be smiling, they should be crying. Direct accusations about something should elicit an immediate response. However, a delay in responding can be a sign that the accusation is true. Also be aware of any disconnect between verbal and nonverbal cues. If somebody is nodding their head like in a yes motion while they're saying no, then there could be a disconnect. So like I said, a person nodding their head while saying no or shaking their head while saying yes may be a sign of deception. If there's a disconnect in emotion, that could also be a sign of deception. Clearing the throat or swallowing prior to answering may be indicators of deceptiveness. And if a person puts their hand to their mouth, licks their lips, pulls their ear, or touches their face or head, it's also another classic deceptive behavior. And lastly, failure to deny. The truth is the biggest ally of the honest. Someone who's honest is able to just be open and talk about the truth, in all its glory. And if, they might be willing to admit a small mistake. But someone who's lying has a hard time denying because, it may be true. So people oftentimes think that they can trust or depend on lie detectors. Lie detectors, also known as polygraph tests, in reality detect bodily arousal such as anxiety or skin sweating. But they tend to produce a large number of false positives, meaning that they tend to be biased against innocent. They're likely to say someone is lying when they're not. And so polygraph tests are generally not admissible as evidence in court. The best lie detectors are slightly better than chance, 50-50. So why do people use lie detectors if they're not admissible in court? Well, many people believe that they're used mainly as a manipulation tactic to kind of strong arm witnesses into to confessing, or suspects into confessing, basically. And so because people believe that they're real, and so it may be a useful tool to get people to fess up. So let's talk about the role of emotion in addiction. So if it's true, as we've talked about, how people repress emotions and they try to avoid reality, addiction can also be seen as an emotional avoidance, a way to avoid emotions. Addiction provides a temporary escape from negative emotions, and unfortunately, they also tend to numb positive emotions too. So as I've talked about before in the past, I've had clients who've suffered from a lot of trauma, and they rely on the alcohol or substances to help them medicate that pain. And so that's why I've always said, if I went through some of the stuff that they went through, I would be less judgmental, and I would not be judgmental. I would be very understanding, because who knows, maybe I might have ended up in the same boat as them. A lot of times, not to say that it's helpful or healthy, but it definitely helps us understand that many people use substances to numb emotional pain. And it's maladaptive because it only works temporarily. So that's the key. It's temporary escape. But people use it a lot of times for that. Now, they may not start off drinking alcohol or using drugs. A lot of times people, for that purpose, they may use it recreationally. But when they experience negative emotions, they quickly realize, oh wait, where do I go to escape from that feeling? Because I've avoided it before, or I've had some relief from it before. So they think, oh, I'll go back and use. And so people find themselves in this cycle of addiction where they feel worse, and then they use the drugs or alcohol to avoid that pain, that shameful feeling. And then it creates more problems, which they seek to escape from. So addiction can be seen as an emotional process with at least 3 stages. As I said, it starts off with a pleasure state, which serves to distract from or numb negative emotions. So oftentimes it starts off recreationally. However, pleasure is not an emotion, as it's not the same as happiness. Something to think about. As people seek pleasure, it's not the same as happiness. It only provides a temporary relief, but it doesn't really make people happy. In fact, more often than not, it makes them feel worse. So the result is a negative emotional state, such as feelings of shame, that lead to a negative reinforcement of the addiction, because then people realize, oh, how do I escape from this negative emotion? Oh, I'll go back and use my substance. So then the next phase is preoccupation, or the anticipation of a new pleasure state, as they seek out the drug or alcohol or whatever it is. It may not be a chemical. It could be porn or a process addiction that will help them to feel better again. And so as they think about, and oftentimes the anticipation of the new pleasure is even more pleasurable than the actual pleasure itself. And that's when you know you're addicted. When the anticipation is more desirable than the actual pleasure, then you know you're addicted. Because what happens is that once people use, they realize, it didn't really satisfy, so they have to use again, and they feel worse, so they really have to use again, and it just becomes a downward spiral. So here we look at it as a diagram. As you can see, the pleasure state leads to the negative emotion, which makes them want to use again. So then they are preoccupied with using again, and they anticipate the pleasure, and that anticipation can be even more pleasurable than the pleasure state itself. So that leads us to, how do we break out of this cycle? I think addiction is really just a symptom of deeper issues on an emotional level. And so to break out of addiction is really an emotional process. And that's what we talk about when we talk about emotional sobriety. So problems do not stem from the negative emotions. Let's be clear about that. Addictions, problems, mental disorders, they're not actually the result of the negative emotions themselves. Negative emotions are, I would think God created us to have negative emotions for a reason, or you might think of it biologically, we have negative emotions for a good reason. But the problems are not from that. Rather, it's how we cope with those emotions. What do you do? Do you repress them, or do you allow yourself to process through negative emotions? So the concept of emotional sobriety comes from the addiction field and implies that just because one has withdrawn from substances does not mean they've fully resolved the underlying emotions. So just to be clear, for example, there's a lot of people talk about dry drugs. You might recover from alcoholism, but you've never really recovered from the emotional processes that underlie your addiction. You may still be emotionally avoidant, for example. So addiction may merely be a symptom of deeper issues. What oftentimes happens is that people quit one addiction and they go right to another addiction. They may switch from alcohol to porn, or they may switch to alcohol to drugs, or they may switch from porn to another sex addiction, or something else. They may go to gambling, And so people switch addictions all the time because they haven't dealt with the deeper issues. I really believe addiction is just a symptom of deeper emotional issues. And oftentimes those deeper issues are intricately connected to relationship patterns. People use, for example, when there are problems in their family relationships. And so it becomes a part of the family in a sense. So when we quit addictions, we have to think about how do we restructure a family sometimes. So emotional sobriety does not mean feeling happy all the time. Let's be clear about that. Emotional sobriety does not mean being happy. In fact, recovering from addiction does not promise that one will be free of problems and bad feelings. In fact, as I've said before, sobriety can actually be more painful than, obviously addiction creates its own problems. And so that's why people want to quit the addiction. But sobriety sometimes can feel really awful to people because now they have to face their problems and their bad feelings. Now they have to learn how to cope with their negative emotions. And it can be challenging for some people. So we have to be realistic. We want people to go into sobriety knowing that it is challenging. It's going to be hard. It's going to be, you're going to have to experience new feelings that you may never felt before. Even people who are addicted to things like innocuous as caffeine, when they cut that caffeine, they may discover that now they have to learn how to cope with the stress in a new way. Now they have to learn how to focus in their lives without using that caffeine. It's something as innocuous as that. So sobriety doesn't necessarily mean, it could be, we could use it broadly and loosely, when we talk about not using any substance or process addiction to help us cope. Sobriety simply means, hey, we have to be open to all the emotions that we're experiencing, positive and negative. So rather, emotional sobriety is about being in the present moment and allowing oneself to feel the entire range of one's feelings again, tolerating what you are feeling, and learning better ways of coping with them instead of turning to our addictions. So that's really key. That's what emotional sobriety is about, is being present, and that may be challenging for some people. Learning to tolerate negative feelings, that's really key. So when we work toward emotional sobriety, we begin to allow ourselves to sometimes even slowly re-experience traumas. Now, obviously, you may need some support. You may want to talk to a counselor or a therapist to help you with that. But at some point in emotional sobriety, you will re experience traumas, whether or not you like it. And so you may want to, get the support and the tools you need as you start to re uncover those traumas. And this will allow us to begin to digest and resolve them so that these traumas no longer have power in our lives. So, for example, those people who use drugs or alcohol or other process addictions to cope with trauma in their life, when they cut those things out of their lives, they now have to learn how to actually chip away at their trauma. Sometimes people are surprised that these traumas have reemerged after all this time. Well, it's probably because they were avoiding it to begin with. And now that they're no longer avoiding it through using these process addictions or chemicals, now they have to learn to actually deal with them. And that's not necessarily bad. It just means you have to be ready for it and get the tools you need. Unfortunately, some people are not ready, and that's sometimes why people relapse and they go back into their addictions. So it's important to have support and counseling when you are about to go through the reemergence of some of these negative emotions. Unfortunately, many people will take their bad feelings and try to pray it away, use meditation to escape from it, or spiritually distract themselves from it. It sounds positive because, it sounds like a positive helping coping mechanism, which, is certainly better than the chemicals, and for many people that may be a better alternative to using drugs or alcohol, granted. So let's keep that in perspective. But it's still not effective. John Wellwood coined the term spiritual bypass and defined it as using spiritual ideas and practices to sidestep personal, emotional, unfinished business, to shore up a shaky sense of self, or to belittle basic needs, feelings, and the developmental tasks, all in the name of enlightenment. So what's the alternative? The alternative is really just facing those negative emotions, the unfinished business, and working through it with a therapist or and pray, maybe through your spiritual resources, but working through it, not trying to ignore it or avoid it. That's the key. Spiritually speaking, in Christ's Beatitudes, Jesus taught that happiness comes through an awareness of our real state rather than escape from it. We talked about in the past, I mentioned that Zen Buddhism talks about detachment from suffering. I think there's a lot of value in mindfulness, but ignoring or avoiding and detaching isn't necessarily working through, some of the things we need to work through. And it's maybe better to actually embrace the hurt in our lives and to actually work through it. So Jesus said, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." Ironically, healing comes through tears. There's a song, I can't remember what it's, blessings. What if blessings come through raindrops? It's a beautiful song, I believe, by Laura Story. And it's just a reminder that, you will find happiness when you allow yourself to cry. If you try to shut off the mourning, if you try to shut off the sadness, you also shut off the happiness. You cannot experience, it's hard to experience happiness if you are numbing the other range of your emotions. So some forms of emotional coping that are effective include seeking help from supportive people, prayer, if it's not some kind of ritualistic kind of prayer where you're just simply avoiding, and we're talking about like a deep reflective prayer where you really listen to your feelings and meditate on it and really surrender it. We're not some avoidant kind of prayer. Journaling, because journaling can be very reflective, and exercise. Exercise, if it's not simply just to numb your mind out and avoid thinking about something, but exercise can help you to heal, and it helps you to burn off some of the anxiety and stress you may have that comes from traumatic memories, for example. So lastly, I want to talk about emotional intelligence. We talked about emotional sobriety, which is really a prerequisite for emotional intelligence. But what is emotional intelligence? This is something that's really key for a lot of people. If we want to be effective leaders or in our workplaces, or if we want to be effective in our relationships and dating lives and family lives, we want to have emotional intelligence. It's actually considered to be a good quality for leaders. It's something to think about. So according to Daniel Goleman, there's 4 components of emotional intelligence, and they are self-awareness, social awareness, self-management, and relationship management. Self-awareness is awareness about ourselves and our feelings and our needs. Social awareness is awareness about other people around us. And so, we talked about mindfulness and awareness that really goes along with that. But it's more than just awareness. It's also our ability to self-regulate, pay attention, and manage our emotions. So that's where our ability to activate our parasympathetic system and to control or change our thinking and to really help ourselves to calm down when we're feeling stressed. That would be self-management. Then there's also relationship management, the ability to effectively communicate and to manage the preservation of relationships rather than cutting people off. So all of these things are really important for what is considered emotional intelligence. So here's some competencies that are associated with each of them. So self-awareness can be considered to include emotional self-awareness, having an accurate self-assessment, and self-confidence. Social awareness involves empathy, service orientation, meaning we're not domineering, but we're actually thinking about how we serve other people because we value other people, as well as organizational awareness. These are people who are savvy about political dynamics in an organization. They're aware of the emotional contagion in a group. They're able to read a group and see the tone of a group, and they're able to match themselves to that. Then there's self-management. These people have emotional self-control. They're trustworthy. They're conscientious. They're adaptable, flexible, and they have an achievement drive. They're able to maintain their motivation. They're able to get up in the morning and to have initiative. And lastly, relationship management. This includes being able to empower and develop others and to help others to become leaders. They have the ability to influence others. They're able to communicate their feelings and to negotiate with others. They're able to manage conflict. They're able to cast a vision and have hope and lead others. They're able to catalyze change. They're able to build bonds between people and support teamwork and collaboration. These are the kinds of people you want to have as leaders in your organization. And that's why emotional intelligence is really a good quality to have in leaders. That's the last thing, and I hope you can join us for our next chapter, chapter 23, How Relationships Can Help or Harm Us. We're going to talk about relationship trauma and relationship security. Thank you.